they're big questions. Okay, well, I'm ready to hit record.
Okay. I've hit record on my end too, so
Okay, here we go.
okay. Very awkwardly. Um, Welcome to my student podcast. I have the pleasure of having Dr. Mendenhall on. She works as a professor at the University of Rhode Island in their Marine Affairs Department. She works in ocean governments covering the UN Law of the Sea Convention, which is very cool. It will also be referred to as
Thank you.
UNCLOS in the podcast for those who will be confused by that acronym later down the road. And her work covers many areas, including cruise ships and COVID-19, nuclear waste transportation, and many more. And why she's here today, marine plastic pollution. I decided to cover this because I have had a love of the ocean since my mom let me go swimming at 6 months in it, and I have never looked back. And when I talk about it to my nieces and nephews, I want them to have that joy with me for the rest of their lives as well. So, yeah.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, that's a kind of a common experience for how people come to the topic of ocean issues and ocean governance is a meaningful interaction with the ocean that they've had that they want to make sure that others can have.
So yeah, we'll start off with a really super easy question because we're both big animal lovers, if you cannot tell by the animal posters that hang on my wall and the animal posters that hang on her wall, which is what is your favorite ocean animal and why?
Easy question. I really like the basking shark. It is featured on the wall behind me. It's one of three filter feeding sharks. It's the second biggest shark in the world. And I just like the way it lives its life. So, like, if you can picture a whale shark, which most people can, it's also a filter feeder, but it has more of a like horizontal orientation to its mouth when it's open and it's feeding. The basking shark is more like a circle with its open mouth. And so it's a pretty big shark. People often confuse it with a great white shark. It just swims along on the surface of the ocean, mouth wide open, just eating all the plankton it can find. It's called the basking shark because it's often up in the sunny parts of the ocean, kind of basking in the sun. And it just travels around, mouth wide open, getting all it can out of life. Sometimes they aggregate in groups of 100 or more. Sometimes you can see them on your own, and they just sort of live all over the world, and they're really cool.
Yes, they're found off the oceans from where I was raised, which is very cool. Mine would have to be sea otters. I just think they're so cute. And they're just like terribly social animals like me. And so like I love that they just like take care of their young and they have a special rock pocket. I want a special rock pocket. That just sounds like such a fun life to live, being
Yeah, they're very capable.
yeah, and just being a little sea otter, but I also think it probably has to do with I used to work at the Vancouver Aquarium and I got to see all the little baby sea otters we rescued, and they're just the cutest things on the planet.
Oh, they're so fuzzy, right? They're fuzzy at first, and then they get kind of like slick and oily.
Yeah. They're
Yeah,
always fuzzy when they're
adorable.
dry. They're just babies stay dry more than the parents do.
Mhm.
So yeah. Um, I have another one which I thought would be interesting given that we're listening to the books podcast in our class, which is given our shared academic interest in Ian Urbina's book, The Outlaw Ocean, do you have like a favorite or like most relevant chapter that you can think about?
Favorite or most relevant? Both of those are hard because they're all relevant to different topics. And I think the experience of reading the whole book, was a favorite, like the way the chapters flowed into one another. But the chapter that came to mind as the most shocking and interesting to me was the one about basically floating mercenary hotels in parts of, I think he focused on the African coast, especially like around the Gulf of Aden, where shipping transit can be dangerous, that there's a risk of piracy or attacks of various kinds. And so there's these ships where basically private security firms have individuals stay in between jobs where they go on boats and basically provide security and protection. And like Ian Urbina went there. He goes to all of these places and he just describes kind of the culture of these places and the economics of these places in a way that was really vivid and memorable. And it was a phenomenon at sea that I had never heard of, never thought about. And so it really kind of added to my diversity of understanding about how law enforcement does or does not work on the ocean.
Yeah, that was fair. For me, it was the Palau with their like three naval boats trying to combat illegal Chinese fishing, which I thought was quite interesting. And then I learned that they don't recognize mainland China as a country, which makes that a much more complicated international matter, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, they also have a compact of free association with the United States that, among other things, requires them to only allow the US to have military access to Palau, which is basically like you can't allow China, you can't have any military agreements with China. But yeah, that one fact that stands out to me from that chapter, it might have been from the original New York Times article before he turned it into a book, is that Palau in land area is the size of Philadelphia, but in ocean area is the size of France. That just, for whatever reason, that stuck in my head. And so I use that to teach students about the challenges of illegal fisheries enforcement all the time.
Very true. And then we'll jump into serious business as it's written in my notes here. Which is there a specific clause of the Law of the Sea Convention that you see as being particularly important as the Plastic Pollution Treaty is currently in the legal drafting stage, which will help their case for reducing plastic?
There is a clause or an article that's particularly important. Whether or not it will help or would be helpful to point out, I don't know. So I happen to be preparing to teach my graduate students about this clause today. So it's sort of fresh in my mind. It's Article 207 of UNCLOS. It's about pollution from land-based sources. And remember that UNCLOS was created, designed primarily in the 1970s and early 1980s. So this clause is kind of old. We committed to it a long time ago. And it says states shall adopt laws and regulations, so in their domestic legal systems, to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from land-based sources. The next paragraph says states have to take other measures as may be necessary to prevent, reduce, and control such pollution. So it uses terms like shall adopt, necessary measures. Another clause, it says best practicable measures. And when states are doing this in the domestic legal system, according to Article 207, they're supposed to at least take into account internationally agreed rules like this new plastics treaty. So states are already obligated to be preventing, reducing, and controlling pollution from land-based sources, which roughly 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from land-based sources. And so the thing to remember is number one, we shouldn't reinvent this wheel. Like the general obligation already exists. But number two, this article didn't have the effect of really shaping state behavior. And so we need to get a lot more specific and a lot more obligatory if we want states to actually take the necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control land-based pollution. And just one last point on this. If you go further down in Article 207, it says states are supposed to harmonize their policies on land-based pollution and to act through diplomatic conferences to establish global and regional rules about land-based pollution. So this plastic treaty negotiation that's happening now, at first there was a lot of patting ourselves on the back, like, oh, good, we're finally doing something. But we've been obligated to do this since at least 1994 when UNCLOS entered into force. And so the obligation to participate and the obligation to make domestic rules that reflect these international rules is already there.
Fair. So it's more like maybe make it more specific rather than making something new is the way that they should go about it in drafting the
Yeah, we're not starting from scratch. We're building on these obligations. And also, if any state were to say, well, I don't want to participate in the plastic treaty negotiations, or it's not my responsibility to domesticate what's in the plastic treaty. I didn't like the way it ended up. If they're a member of UNCLOS, which 168 states plus the EU are members of UNCLOS, they're obligated to do that. And so the kind of obligation to act is already stronger than a lot of observers characterize it. Like the plastic treaty isn't building on a blank slate, it's building on these obligations we've had to the ocean environment since at least 1994.
yeah. And then as we're kind of seeing like transnational corporations kind of come into playing a large role with their like commercial shipping and stuff, how do you see like constraints being necessary to like make sure that the commercial side of like ocean use is also being regulated as well?
Yeah, well, the plastics treaty is supposed to be a full life cycle treaty, so from production through consumption, disposal, and even cleanup. So most of the treaty is not focused on the marine environment. There is one clause in the draft treaty I was just looking at this morning about perhaps remediation or removal of plastic that's already in the ocean. But most of the focus of the treaty is rightly, I think, on plastic production and consumption. Um, and as far as impacting business practices, it's a lot more, I think, important for us to focus on total plastic product production and then also the design of plastic products for reusability. And yes, recyclability, although that's going to be way less impactful than reducing our overall consumption of plastic. And phasing out in areas where it's possible single-use plastics. And so the plastics treaty, if you look at the most recent draft, it's kind of all over the place. There's a lot that's left to be decided. So I would not confidently predict where we're going to end up. But there are options in there for kind of production controls around the amount and types of products we produce. But as with any international treaty, what's critical is that states domesticate these specific rules into their domestic legal systems, because that's really, I guess you might say, where the rubber hits the road or where the proof is in the pudding, or whatever non-idiomatic way of saying, that's where enforcement actually happens. The relationship between states and private plastic producers, whether they're producing, the plastic nurdles at the beginning, or they're producing the plastic products and selling them to consumers in the retail store. They're going to be most affected by domestic regulatory systems. So it's important that the treaty require states that ratify it to domesticate really specific provisions on plastic production.
Are there any like front runners in countries that you see that are doing really well at regulating plastic production?
Um, I don't feel very confident expertise wise in saying for sure this country or that country, but the EU has definitely gone further than most in terms of, for example, incorporating extended producer responsibility into plastic production, where those involved in production have to pay to some degree for plastic recycling and disposal. Other states that stand out are like Rwanda on banning single-use plastic bags earlier than everybody else. But the UN Environment Program, with some regularity, they put out reports that kind of summarize the status of national anti-plastic regulations. They don't say anti-plastic, but you know what I mean, to control the problem of plastic waste. That sort of show who the leaders are, where the models are, what the patterns are. So that'd be the best source of information to really answer that question with some detail.
Yeah, I remember hearing about Rwanda when I was like 13 and I'm like, this feels miles ahead of where everyone else is. And it was very,
Mhm.
very shocking. And I remember explaining it to my Nana. She did not believe me until I looked it up for her. It was very funny.
Yeah, well, and not to discount the importance of that kind of leadership and that kind of model, but it is easier to do bold things in small states. The constituent group is smaller. The economies might not be as globalized or diverse, perhaps. So there aren't as many, maybe not as many or the same entrenched economic interests. It's easier to get a smaller group of people to focus on, one new initiative. And so it's not unusual for a smaller state in terms of territory and population like Rwanda to do something so big and bold. But they certainly deserve a lot of credit for it.
Yeah, I remember it was like it was because their like trash and recycling system, like the plastic you used, you could immediately see it on the street, whereas like in a lot of
Mhm.
more like developed countries in the global north, like we never see the plastic we throw away. Whereas like in Rwanda, they saw it immediately, and so it was a little bit easier to be like, this is a problem, rather than like it hiding behind landfills and stuff for a little bit longer in Canada and other places.
Yeah, that's a little bit of an irony of this whole phenomenon because a big part of the solution to plastic pollution in the ocean is modern waste management systems. We need more places to have more modern waste management systems. But as you point out, those modern waste management systems create distance between ourselves and the plastic that we are disposing. And so if we're disposing just as much plastic, but we're not seeing it or thinking about it as directly as we might without the modern waste management system, it might be that we're just kind of externalizing the problem further away from us and not actually reducing it.
Yeah, I was reading through kind of like a summary of UNCLOS. I didn't read the whole 200-page document, unfortunately.
Mhm.
And I noticed that you also mentioned that there's a difference between states being held responsible and states being held liable under UNCLOS. Can you talk about the difference between that?
Yeah, and under UNCLOS, these are pretty vague rules. And so the article that myself and a co-author, Khalil Hassan Ali, wrote was about adding stronger responsibility and liability provisions. So responsibility is basically when it's sort of a state's fault that a rule was violated, that the state didn't act legislatively, judicially, administratively, and as a result, an actor under that state's control or jurisdiction, perhaps a shipping company, violated an international law. And so responsibility is saying the state should have made sure that didn't happen. The state needs to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. Liability is a step further in that it involves an assessment of the damage caused by that rule violation, and it holds that state liable for paying for that damage. And so responsibility and liability often go together. But liability is harder to prove, harder to make happen. Number one, because you have to figure out, well, what damages and who was damaged. Is it one specific other actor, or is it like the whole international community? It's easier when it's one specific actor and they can prove this is the damage that happened, and it happened because you did not meet your responsibility state. So that's issue number one, is kind of proving about the damages. And number two is holding the state liable as opposed to the private actor. It's really easy for a state to say, well, that wasn't us. Like we were doing what we were supposed to administratively, legislatively, judicially, but that company is just a bad company. It's not our fault, it's their fault. Well, states need to create domestic legal systems wherein they can get the money from the company and then give it to the international party that experienced the damages. But it's true in business in general, but especially businesses that operate in and around the sea, that there's often a big distance between the state that's supposed to be exercising jurisdiction and the private actor who's actually doing the maybe nefarious things at sea. Because you've got shell corporations, you've got flags of convenience. It's very distant out in the ocean often. So a lot of times, a state can sort of say, well, we have sort of deniability. This what like we were meeting our responsibilities. The private actor that should be liable, but also private actors can basically run and hide fairly easily as a result of all these kind of screens between themselves and the states that are supposed to be controlling their behavior.
They can like move it to like a very like a state that doesn't have the capacity to actually go after them.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
like, it's like I think it's like Panama, Bermuda, the Bahamas is where everyone parks their boats and pretends their company works out of, even if it's headquartered in the US type idea.
Yeah, the only language you just used that I would change is parks their boat because a lot of times the boats don't ever even go there. So you can flag in Liberia or Panama or Malta or even Mongolia, which is a landlocked state, and never have to go in and out of their ports. Um, so this whole flags of convenience phenomenon is a much bigger topic that causes problems in other areas, but it's a solid example of the distance between the private actor that's benefiting from private activity and the state that's supposed to be exercising jurisdiction over its flagged ships.
Yeah. And on the mention of private actors doing nefarious things on the high seas, in one of your papers, you mentioned the 1992 convention, which sets up a fund for compensation to clean up oil spills. Is this kind of a feasible solution for plastic pollution? Could it be modified to be an effective tool for us in cleaning up ocean marine plastic?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, theoretically. So the 1992 agreement that you're referring to is about liability for oil spills. and it is kind of organized by the International Maritime Organization that deals with issues related to shipping. And so basically, if you are an oil importer, you pay into this fund. And if and when an oil spill happens, that fund can be drawn on to support cleanup of the oil spills. And so basically, it's like a shared risk pool. Oil exports and imports, they're creating the risk because oil is being transited across the ocean so that states who want to import it can import it by sea. And so they're all creating that risk. So they all pay into the fund. And it doesn't matter necessarily where the oil spill happened or who's directly responsible. That fund can be drawn on to clean up that oil spill. So theoretically, a shared risk model like this could be applied to the problem of plastic pollution. And indeed, in looking through the draft text this morning, I noticed that there is some language about a trust fund for remediation of plastic, um, I guess, deposits or accumulations in the ocean. Now, it doesn't seem like we're moving in the same direction of like people, or well, states rather, involved in the plastic economy in some way as exporters or importers or consumers, that they would have to pay in based on that participation in the global plastics economy. Um, it seems more like we're leading up to, states as members of this treaty would every year give a certain amount of money. But what I saw in the draft treaty is not very well articulated, and it's also still in brackets. So personally, I would be surprised if we end up with a shared pool of money to do plastic cleanup. Um, but it's a model that's worked with oil for reasons that we might take lessons from. Like there were a bunch of oil spills in the 60s and 70s, which is when these liability regimes started to be discussed, that really captured a lot of public attention. We've all seen the images of birds covered in oil. And the industry basically wasn't good for the industry for oil traveling across the ocean to have such a bad look, bad reputation. And the industry sort of working through the IMO, one of the benefits of going through the International Maritime Organization is it promotes like a close collaboration between industry and states. And because it's all so maritime, I think it was a little more doable than in the plastic situation where the producers are very much on land, not necessarily thinking about what they're doing as being an ocean activity. And there isn't an equivalent to the International Maritime Organization to bring together everyone involved in the plastics economy. So it's an important model for us to think about and draw lessons from. I don't anticipate it being used for plastic. However, maybe we can think about the conditions that would facilitate a model like that being considered feasible by states.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think, we also see that like a lot of like the bad press with plastic as well, like the animals tangled up in nets and stuff like that. So I think it leads to a larger conversation, but unfortunately plastic is such a broad category compared to oil spills, so it kind of
Yeah,
all.
it's way harder to demonstrate accountability in the case of plastic too, especially when it's in the ocean. It's like, okay, well, do I blame the Coca-Cola Corporation or do I blame the consumer who purchased this in the first place, or do I blame the state that didn't have a modern waste management system? Or do I blame the country that collected this as a recyclable and then exported it to that state to get rid of it? Like, accountability is very difficult to demonstrate. And even if you can connect all the parts of the causal chain, it's hard to say who exactly is to blame along it.
Yeah, and then you say that the new plastics treaty will be at the core of global government regimes for plastics. What would you like to see in terms of governance?
Well, a lot. I would like to see more direct requirements for plastic production and plastic design. And by more direct, I mean specific in the treaty must be domesticated by states, more uniformity. Because my fear is that if we end up with a treaty model that has obligations for states that have a lot of wiggle room, they're relatively vague, and ask states to have a nationally determined contribution to those general goals, which it looks like that's the kind of treaty we're moving towards, very similar to the Paris Agreement, where we have shared global goals, and then you determine nationally what your contribution is going to be, and then you're supposed to report on that. Um, that just is a recipe for a very uneven governance landscape. And an uneven governance landscape where different states have different laws and different capacity and interest to enforce those laws leads production and consumption, but especially production, to shift around to the most favorable jurisdiction. So I think because plastics is so globalized, so internationally traded, it's a very shared global problem. We need some uniformity. And we need to force uniformity onto domestic legal systems by requiring it in the treaty. But it's really hard to say anything about what kind of treaty we're going to get at this point. I mean, we are moving in directions, but I invite all of your listeners to download the most recent plastics treaty draft. It's available online. The next round of negotiations is supposed to be the last, is in the end of November, beginning of December 2024, so coming up. But you can see in the draft text all the brackets, which is language that hasn't been decided upon, and all the bold, which is new language that was suggested in the last round of negotiations. And you can see there's a wide range of possibility. Even in provisions that require something, there's the option of may versus shall. There's options like um, adding effective as an adjective onto things that states have to do. So considering a standard of is this working or not, that may or may not be included in the final treaty. So the draft we have now could end up being a very soft, unenforceable, light treaty, or it could end up being very specific and strong. But as you mentioned in our previous conversations, you got to find that balance between a design that will work, but also one that states are willing to adopt.
Yeah, that's always the hard part is making states adopt. I always feel like with like plastic negotiations and especially like ocean and climate negotiations as a whole, it always feels like it ends up being the tragedy of the commons type idea.
Yeah, I might even call it very differently, but also the same, the tragedy of the territorial state system, because states see themselves as in competition with one another, and their primary goals are national security and economic growth. And in a competitive economic landscape, economic growth and comparative advantage are like very connected to one another. So there's a real fear of free riding that if they take on strong domestic restrictions on their economy, others won't. And that state that took on the strong restrictions will kind of lose out. And there's a lot of lobbying as well. I mean, the plastics industry and the fossil fuel industry are either strongly overlapping or you might even think of them as one and the same, in that most plastics come from petroleum. And they're very powerful. And so there's one thing that we can say for sure about new pro-environment international law is that having a very aware and engaged global public is important to making things happen. Like states have to perceive that investing in a strong treaty will benefit them politically on the domestic level, because states are governments and not all of them are going to be in power forever. They want to maintain their power typically. Um, so we are the domestic audience. We've got to make sure that we're pushing and pressuring, but also rewarding governments who invest a lot in a strong plastics treaty.
That's a very good message. That is a very good message as we come to the end of a year where over half of the global population has held an election for a national leader, which I
Oh,
think
well.
is a very wild fact that happened this year. It did help that India held their elections and they are like 1.4 like billion people, so that probably did help our numbers. But as we're coming to the end here, what message would you have for students pursuing careers in the field of affairs, especially from like a political science side of thing?
Yeah, marine affairs is a broad field. So my best advice is choose and chart a path for yourself. And it can be hard for students to make decisions about what they want to focus on because they're just not sure. You can make those decisions a little bit at a time and think, okay, well, am I interested in like the water column or am I interested in the seafloor? Am I interested in living resources or non-living resources? Am I interested in maybe working for a nonprofit or working for a company or working for the government? Am I interested in doing research or am I interested in education? Do I want to work alone or do I want to work with a team? Like some of these decisions you can start making now. But when you graduate, or when you are kind of charting a path in the career world, like your own professional path, it helps a lot if you can say, I did most of my research science assignments in my classes on the offshore wind industry, or I really focused on um, the role of non-governmental actors in lobbying governments. And I've done projects on aquaculture and on wild capture fisheries resources and on seabed mining. So, like having an angle or taking a slice of the topic is something that you can do now, even when you're taking classes that seem to have pretty general titles, because most of your classes will have within them assignments where there's flexibility to choose your topic. And so when you graduate, you want to be able to say, I have broad knowledge of these topics, but I have specialized knowledge or particular skills in these areas. And that really depends on how you choose to use your time in your educational program.
Yeah, so like taking, even if you don't have a course on marine affairs, but taking the courses you have to take and tailoring it to what you want to do later in the assignments.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, you probably have a curriculum that's a little bit set for you. I mean, I know that there are some majors are more flexible than others. So think about the classes that you're choosing to take, of course, but within those classes, think about how you can build on what you've already learned. Like, of course, you got to write a new paper for every paper assignment. But if you wrote a paper about Palau's fishery enforcement in your last class, and now you're taking a class about, something to do with labor economics, for example, maybe you focus on reemployment training in Palau into or out of fisheries. Like you can think about taking different approaches that different classes prepare you for, but pointing in the same direction or pointing towards the same topic. And as a result, you'll graduate with kind of a specialized set of knowledge or a focused set of knowledge that you gained by making those choices in your different classes.
I think that that is a very wonderful message to end on. We ended up at 32 minutes, which is pretty good. So I just
Sure, you
want
can make some cuts if needed.
I think I started recording a little bit early at the beginning when we were still just like having a
Right.
little chat, so it'll be okay. But I wanted to thank you so much. This is kind of, been really nice that I'm finally in my third year and I can kind of do things about that I enjoy doing now, which is like ocean governance, which is very interesting for me. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I am teaching my graduate students about the plastics treaty today, so it was helpful to prepare and think about that. And just good luck with the rest of the class and the rest of your program.
Yeah, thank you. It's